Yeah, in this episode, I want to talk about psychology and alchemy with you.
Okay.
So it's something I've been studying for the last few years. I've discussed it with you kind of here and there. But I want to get your thoughts on it because it's a strange subject. It's kind of an arcane, weird, occult subject that no one really looks at. And I didn't think much of it until I was studying Carl Jung's work and realized that the last 20 years of Carl Jung's life, he dedicated to articulating the alchemical corpus. So he obviously found something deeply meaningful in there. And I've read...
Well, and astronomy and UFOs.
Yeah. I only found
out, what was that move?
I don't know.
You know what I mean? Like he just, he just got, well, he kind of went like astral. So he hit alchemy, which is like Earth or terrestrial. And then he got really into astronomy and then UFOs. So it's like his consciousness was kind of leaving the locus of the here and now, the present cultural, whatever was relevant to the culture. And then he just like floated way before he died. He was already like, like sublimating, because his body was being sublimated like even before he left. But so you're saying that the alchemical interest kind of kicked that off first.
Yeah. And that reminds me of Terence McKenna. Like, remember Terence McKenna at the end of his life? He was coming up with this, I forget what he called it, this something wave theory.
Time wave zero?
Yeah, he thought that he'd like mapped out all these historical events and found patterns between them in a way where he could predict the future. And that's where I worry about Jung, because he went so far into this strange subject. And a lot of even Jungian scholars say that there's nothing of value in Jung's work on psychology, that it's just kind of random and chaotic, and he was seeing patterns in it that weren't really there. But then I read Jordan Peterson's Maps of Meaning book, and I've read that book like 6 times now. And it's like 500 pages long.
Can we just take a moment and appreciate how insane that is? You're probably one of 5 people in the entire planet that have read that book 6 times.
Yeah,
it's so brutal.
It's the most painful book I've ever read. It's like, it's emotionally painful to read. It's very difficult to read, but I find so much meaning in it that I just keep coming back to it. And it took me like 5 times reading through it to like really grapple with some of the ideas. And I don't even claim that I have grappled with them all. But he dedicates like a fifth of the book at the end to alchemy. And study of alchemy, and his whole idea around chaos and order and the process of transforming chaos into order. He maps it to alchemical symbolism. So I've been studying all of Jung's work on alchemy and just trying to wrap my head around it. And what I've done today, let me share my screen with you. So I've put together this series of images that I'm going to walk through that just represent like some of the it's kind of a set of story images that I put together for me to try and explain how I'm thinking about alchemy. But I just want to point out that this is just scratching the surface. And it's funny because Carl Jung thought that his work on alchemy was just scratching the surface of alchemy, and he wrote tomes on it. So in this, I'm just scratching the surface of the surface, and I'm barely delving into these ideas, but I thought it would be useful to bring up these images, talk about how I'm thinking about them, and then have a discussion with you about like anything that comes to mind, because I'm not presenting this as something that I know. I'm presenting it as something that I'm trying to figure out. And I'm hoping that these images will help like spark some ideas for us to discuss.
Okay.
Cool. So this is what I'm going to be discussing, the psychology of alchemy. And like I said, like alchemy is a very strange subject. It's like an arcane subject. It's associated with the occult. No one really thinks about alchemy now, except for kind of like, I don't know, if someone's into alchemy, it's the same people who are into astrology in a weird way. And like, it doesn't make a lot of sense on the surface. But I think that there's enormous value in there, like, because in studying the symbolism of alchemy, I've found these ideas that are able to bridge the gap between like scientific psychoanalysis and religion. And that's something that I've always struggled with. And we've had deep discussions about religion. And I think that alchemy fills some gaps in the religious corpus. And that's what I'm going to kind of try and explain today. So before I get started, I just want to ask you, like, what do you know about alchemy? Like, what comes to mind when you think of alchemy, and what are your thoughts on it?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind to me in the way that I understand it, so I've had some religious experiences in my life that really changed the direction of where I was going and pointed me towards what I think is my highest potential. And in the most profound spiritual experience I ever had, I realized that my view on what reality was wrong. And the way that it came to me was, I realized that the inner world of my conscious experience, consciousness itself, and the exterior world of the physical, like matter and physicality as an emergent property, were linked. So the inner experience, like, so I would have a thought, and then I would see that thought manifest as the external, right? So I would have a thought, and it would be like answered by, say, a bird or a car driving by, or like there was a conversation of the two were interlinked in some way. And the deeper I got into it, I kind of realized, like, this is what Krishnamurti was talking about with choiceless awareness, or the in the East, like Ramana Maharshi was talking about with like the non-dual reality. And so I realized that the two were connected. And then, you go deeper into it, as an artist, and you realize, like, all these Renaissance paintings are conveying patterns of consciousness in images, through the symbolism of placing, a dog that represents fidelity over here, and like, a moth, of a entity that transforms, into, a light-seeking animal, whatever, and so you look at it and you realize that, like, oh, this relationship between the inner and outer worlds goes all the way back to the birth of science, which was alchemy. And I've always been attracted and curious about that, but it's so slippery. And so, it's so individualistic, because once you have this insight, you can't really share it, because it's like kind of for you. And the symbolic emergence of meaning in the form of, the external reality is kind of sculpted to you and your meaning making mechanism in your mind. And so when I think about alchemy, I think of it as like the science of meaning as represented in the symbolism of matter. And so when you have something like these early proto-scientists trying to change lead into gold, what they're really trying to do is connect heaven and earth, right? So they're trying to take the basest of elements and transform it into the highest of elements, which inherently has like a divine force in it, because gold represents or embodies these values, spiritual values, like the malleability and untarnishability, brilliance of gold is divine. And so I've always had an interest in that. But again, it's so slippery. And then you try to talk about it and you just lose people immediately, because it's like talking about your dreams that you felt were really important last night, and people just kind of glaze over and check out. So it's something that I've always really done a lot of work on in my own personal life, especially with art, but I haven't really delved too far into it. So I'm excited to be able to hear your insights. But is that a helpful way of?
Absolutely. And I think you're already well on the way to thinking about the psychology of alchemy, and as kind of a psychological bridge between the inner and the outer world. And I totally agree with you. It's very, very slippery to explain, and it's more of an inner experience that's very difficult to communicate with anyone else. So like alchemy started in about the 3rd century BC. So there was a famous alchemist, Zosimos. And it went up until about the 17th century AD, and then it just died out. After the scientific revolution, we had a different understanding of chemistry, and we realized that the alchemists in those 20 centuries never turned lead into gold once. So we kind of abandoned it. But I find it fascinating that we kept up this practice for 20 centuries, and some of the smartest minds in the world kept at it. And what they were trying to do was like transform base matter into gold. And like you said, they were trying to like take something that was in a corrupt state and turn it into a purified state. And what the alchemists, they looked in the earth and they found like pieces of gold in the earth. And they realized that over vast periods of time, the earth compressed, and through that pressure was able to produce higher forms like gold and diamonds. And the alchemist wanted to kind of act as time, or as a replacement for time. So instead of waiting 100,000 years for a piece of coal to turn into a diamond, they thought that there was some sort of method by cooking and cooling and mixing substances that would speed up that whole process. And would allow them to create gold. But 20 centuries of work later, they never did it at all. So you can look back on the alchemical endeavor as a complete failure in that way. And I think that's how a lot of people do that. It was just superstition, like misguided scientific thinking, and that it was just useless. And that brings me to Carl Jung. So alchemy died out in the 17th century. No one really looked at it after that. And a lot of people didn't even realize the connection between alchemy and science. But Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst, he was studying people's dreams at that time. So he was doing therapy by having a patient bring up their dream images, and then discussing them. And he found an enormous amount of mythological symbolism in people's dreams, which he found very strange. So these and Jung was deeply studied in mythology. Like he'd read all the ancient texts. He knew Latin and Greek, and he had this huge wealth of mythological symbols to pull upon. So when one of his patients would bring up one of their dreams, and Jung realized that it reminded him of a myth, he would bring up that mythological image and discuss it with the patient. And somehow by doing that, it helped the patient heal their neuroses. So he found all this strange mythological substrata to our minds, and he couldn't quite explain it. And this is where Freud and Jung come in. So Freud and Jung were really the first two major psychoanalysts who delved into the unconscious. Freud was first there. He was the first to really study dreams and unconscious phenomena. And Jung was one of his students. So they were very close friends. They worked together closely. They were studying the unconscious, studying dreams and symbolism. But it hit a point where they had a fundamental disagreement about the nature of the unconscious. So Freud thought that the unconscious was mostly your personal unconscious. So just those things that you've repressed personally. So things that have happened in your past that you've kind of pushed away from your consciousness. And his method of therapy was just bringing up those repressed contents so you can become conscious of them. And Freud kind of thought that dreams were just chaos. He didn't think that there was some he thought that the dream was actually censoring itself and restricting itself from showing you its true meaning. And Freud also thought that the primary myth of human beings was the Oedipal complex, which is the failed hero's journey. And Jung, he went into the same unconscious, studying his patient's dreams, but he found all of these mythological archetypes that seemed to go beyond the personal unconscious to what he called the collective unconscious. And Jung thought that they were based in religion. So it was a religious instinct or a religious substrata that was generating these mythological images that he started to call the collective unconscious. And Freud and Jung were great friends, and then they had a huge falling out because Freud was kind of anti-religion. He didn't think that the unconscious had a religious substructure, and Jung thought that it did. And Jung thought that the successful hero's journey was the universal hero myth, or the universal human myth, not the Oedipal complex. So I just find that their views on this are fundamentally like fascinating, because Freud delved into the unconscious a lot as well, but he had a totally different view of like what was actually underneath it. And this led Jung to work on what I think is one of the strangest things I've ever read in my life, which is the Red Book. And I think it was actually you who told me about the Red Book initially. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I was doing like a lot of stream of consciousness writing and playing with these ideas about the conscious and unconscious mind. I think I'd read one of Jung's books, and you said you've got to check out his Red Book. It's mind-blowing. And it's the strangest book I've ever read. So Jung basically decided that if he was to get to the bottom of what was happening in the unconscious and in dreams, then he had to go fully into his own imagination to figure it out, instead of just analyzing other patients' dreams. So he came up with this method that he called active imagination, where in a waking state, he would kind of engage in a dream state while he was awake. And scenes would appear in his head, and he would write down what he sees. And he would participate in the action. So he didn't just watch it like it was a movie. He was actually engaged in it. And different figures would emerge in these scenes, like men and women, and he would interact with them and talk to them and have deep conversations with them as if they were real, as if he was talking to a real person. And he realized that a lot of those like spirits that he was talking to were part of him, and that they were archetypal. So they followed like a structure that was similar to what he saw in his patients' dreams. And that's really where he came up with his theory of the archetypes of the collective unconscious. So this is where he kind of went way deeper than Freud and said, no, there's not just a personal unconscious, there's a collective unconscious underneath that is pretty much the same for everyone. So it's universal. So the collective unconscious in you is the same as it is in me. And it seems to be grounded in biology, and it has patterns in it. So it has these patterns of different archetypes that emerge. And he was trying to flesh out what those archetypes are and what they represent. So let me pause here. Like any questions or thoughts on this so far?
Yeah, I'm curious about the connection between the collective unconscious, which seems it's like the external internal reality. So in the same way that alchemy is like the external symbolic reality of consciousness, the collective unconscious is like an external inner reality, where you have your personal experience, but then that personal, my personal experience is that I was born in California.
Yeah.
Right. So, my family and everybody was born in California, but, has its own specific experience here, but then it's nested within the California experience, which is nested in the American experience, which is nested, and so,
yeah,
it's like this kind of a nesting structure of externalities. And I'm curious, because now it's like making me think like, oh, that's maybe what the alchemists were trying to do is, you're a point in space, which is awareness, and then you're making sense of the world based on what feels right to you, and then that expands out, in these like nested like almost like hierarchies of externality. And it seems like it's kind of the first time that I thought about that, but just listening to your presentation, that was the thought that came to me.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. Like, because your personal unconscious is the things that happened to you since the day you were born to now. Like, but, and the question is like, how far does that nesting go back? Because it can go back to the California experience, the American experience, the last 10,000 years of modern human civilization, and back further through evolution to chimpanzees, back to when we were snakes or whatever we were before that. And I don't know how far it goes back. I don't think these collective unconscious archetypes are even just from when biology began. I think Jung kind of infers that they were there from the beginning of time in some way, which is just a mind-blowing idea. But it seems like we're like the first level of psychoanalysis is going into your personal unconscious, because that's easily accessible. You know what happened in your life. But then it seems if you go further, you get into these like biological evolutionary ideas that pop up and emerge, and they seem to have a pattern, but we're barely conscious of it. And Jung's saying that the collective unconscious is kind of like that nesting goes all the way back to God, basically. I don't think he says that explicitly, but the collective unconscious is like the seat of the divine. And it goes way back, way further back than our personal unconscious life. So I just want to walk through like these 4 or 5 images of like some of the core archetypes that he kind of identified in the collective unconscious, and then I'm going to jump into alchemy and try and bridge the gap between them. So the first is the ego, and I think we all have an understanding of what the ego is. The ego is the seat of consciousness. So it's the like center of your experience in the world. And I think like modern people kind of confuse their ego with their personality, because your ego has like individuality. So it kind of seems like it's a personality, and it's the center of our consciousness. So we often consider this the deepest part of ourselves. But Jung's saying that the ego is just the center of the conscious mind. It's just the center of consciousness. And it doesn't take into account the unknown. So there's always, like we've talked about this before, that we're limited beings in an infinite world. So our conscious ego can only know so much, and it's surrounded by all this unknown. So this kind of comes back to our first podcast. We were discussing like, where do you locate the individual? And I think most people locate the individual in the ego, and just who they are consciously in their experience right now. And Jung's saying that this is a deeply important archetype, but it's missing all of the wholeness that comes with the collective unconscious. So the second archetype that Jung identifies, which we've discussed a lot as well, is the shadow.
Can I just stop you for a second?
Yeah.
Are all of these images AI generated?
Most of them, yeah.
What that last one, is that AI or a painting?
That's AI as well.
God damn.
Yeah.
That is wild.
Yeah, I've been using
that is like the painterly gestures on that is very hard to tell. I can't tell, actually. I cannot tell that that's AI. I mean, it looks like a painting.
Yep, it's wild. And I've been generating thousands and thousands of alchemical images, because I think like Jung thought that and I'll get into this a bit later, but Jung thought that the alchemical corpus had the most rich matrix of images about human psychology and religion, like even more than the Bible, I think. So I have this theory that if I'm like, okay, well then AI should, like, the perfect thing for AI to try and visually represent is the alchemical corpus, because it contains the richest symbolism and geometrical structure of symbols about human psychology. So my hypothesis is that AI would be perfect to represent these ideas.
Yeah. Okay, now that I'm looking at it, the pinkies are off. For some reason, AI can't do hands very well.
I know.
You see the pinky. You see the pinkies at the bottom. You're like, okay, that's not quite right. Yeah. But it's just wild to me that you see, like, if you really look at that halo structure, it's got about probably like between 10 and 7%, I would, if I had to guess, more mass on the right side of his head. And typically a halo is always very aligned. It's like when it was represented in the Renaissance era, it was always like just locked in symmetric.
Yeah.
And so it seems like it's a very human kind of misjudgment of mass in representing how that paint or how the paint is representing that that globular light structure, it's like, I would typically look at that and be like, oh, that's a human error for sure. Like the computer would center it definitely, but it's not. It's actually, it's like a little bit off, which makes you think like, oh, that's kind of, it's very human in its imperfection.
Yeah.
You know, because part of what makes human art relatable is that it's not perfect.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So it's a trip looking at that.
And there's also, and it's also in the prompting as well, because there's parameters in the AI prompt where you can say to make it geometrically symmetrical. Or you can say add more randomness and chaos to it. So we kind of have a bit of control over that in a way, but I'm blown away by these images that it's generating. Like I've literally generated probably like 3,000 alchemical images and videos. And it's just stunning to me how much better Midjourney has got over the last year. Like Midjourney only came out a year ago. And when it first came out, the images it generated were shit. Like they looked like a complete mess. And now it's generating paintings that you as an artist don't even know weren't created by a human. It's wild.
I mean, the pattern on his robe is, I mean, it's yeah, it's hard to, but you know, at the end of the day, it's like it just exists in digital space, you know. So I mean, on a screen, it's masterful, but you try to reproduce that and put it into the world where you experience it in the physicality of the real world, it's not going to hold up, really. You know, because you're not going to see the gestures on it. But you know, I mean, it's not. I mean, if you really wanted to reproduce that sculpturally, in the sense that, you know, Renaissance paintings or like Impressionist paintings, they have a three-dimensionality to it, because you can see the kind of like the landscape of the paint, you know, as it's like pushed and pulled with a brush, and there's little like peaks and valleys. I mean that's reproducible. So
yeah,
I mean, it's hard to think that it couldn't. God, I'd be so curious to see. I mean, wow, man, we're gonna have a really hard time knowing. I mean, it's all real. It's all real. At some point, when you like have the thing in itself, it's real.
And if you have the experience, like a meaningful experience looking at it, that experience is real. And
because the reason why you have a meaningful experience with a lot of like part of the reason why Van Gogh's work is so powerful is we have all of his letters. So we know the way that he feels about it. We know the meaning that we know his story, we know his struggles, you know, the biography is there. And so that's learned, you know, it's a story that we take in, and there's no reason why that can't all be reproduced. But the issue is that it's not connected to an actual human, you know. Like somebody made a really good point. I think it was Mark Andreessen made a really good point about AI. He was saying that, you know, we've gotten to the point where AI can beat any human at chess every single time without question. And we could have a scenario where we have AI tournaments to see like what the best model is to be able to win at chess. Nobody cares.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So it's not even really about winning the chess thing. So you could make the same argument here. It's like nobody really cares about AI painting because it's not, the human part's not there.
Yeah.
So the only way that it would have meaning is if you tricked somebody into believing it was a human artist, and then people would be like, "Well, that's amazing because that's a human artist." You know, like you're not going to be interested in a robot beating a human at the 40-yard dash, you know, or a marathon or whatever. So that little part in there is really interesting, and also connects to this kind of alchemical discussion in the sense that, you know, matter in and of itself, even if it's highly animated, is not really interesting until it is transformed into something that has like a divine quality or like a meaningful quality that comes from life, or comes from a human. It comes from consciousness itself. So that little gap, I think, is kind of what we're narrowing in on here, and is super curious. I'm super curious to see how it actually like takes hold in reality.
Yeah, because I keep going back and forth on whether this AI generated images are art or not. I keep coming to a point where I'm like, no, it's not true art because there's no conscious individual expressing something.
Right.
And like Jung showed me that true art comes from the unconscious, and it's a revelation to a conscious mind. And without that tension between the conscious and the unconscious, there's no real art happening.
But it is the culmination. It is the meta individual that's being represented here. So it's almost like Christ itself, because Christ represents being fully divine and fully human. So he's the Alpha and the Omega. So this is representing the Omega.
Well, it's representing
in
it,
some
but
way.
It's not embodying it. That's why I keep thinking.
Okay.
AI is
Yeah.
like, it's like it's not art, but it's an art mirror. It's able to study art and generate images that are artistic, but
it's you, but it's embodied in you because you created it and you're presenting it and you're imbuing it with its power because you're using it as a tool to bring me and the audience along with what it is that you find valuable. So you are the embodiment of this AI, even though you didn't create this image, but you prompted the image.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that the art in this is in the prompting. Because I'm prompting and then selecting images and then prompting again, selecting images. That act of prompting and selecting is an art. But
it's an alchemical, it's an alchemical process, really, because you're coaxing meaning, you're coaxing value, you're transforming, you're transforming through possibility. And the base level of lead is too slow, like what you're talking about. But now with technology, you have something that's very fast. So it is interesting. Like, I've never thought about that before when you were speaking previously in the presentation, that the alchemists thought of themselves as a substitute for time.
Exactly. Yeah.
Which is really fascinating, actually. That might be the key to unlocking this whole thing. And it also allows technology to get in there.
Exactly.
Because technology is just all about speed.
Yeah. And it reminds me of the alchemical dictum, solve et coagula, which is one of the prime dictums, which means dissolve and coagulate. So the alchemists were constantly like taking a brick of some substance that they found or someone had given them. They put it in their alchemical vessel. They heat it up. It dissolves. And then they add other liquids to it and then keep cooking it until it forms another solid. So they were constantly seeing something go from solid to liquid to solid. And
that's what a caterpillar does. So a caterpillar, when it goes into a chrysalis, it dissolves into like this goo and then comes out a butterfly. And that's how stable diffusion works.
Exactly. This is how AI works. Like, because AI is taking this huge data set, dissolving it into this unique model, and then through prompting, it will generate something new. It will coagulate into something new. So, and I'm seeing a lot of people make alchemical references when they're talking about AI, which I find really interesting. So there's some connection between this AI realm and alchemy realm that I've barely even wrapped my head around, but there's something there.
Yeah, you're onto something here for sure. So yeah, that's cool. Sorry to derail the conversation with this.
No problem, mate.
Okay.
So the second archetype that Jung goes through is the shadow, and we've discussed this as well. So the shadow is all the parts of yourself that you reject or don't want to look at. It's your dark side, essentially. It's your capacity for evil. And like Jordan Peterson talks about this quite a lot. Like, a lot of his work is around like consciously recognizing your capacity for evil within, as if you were a Nazi guard or like the worst person. And that's the thing with our shadows, is that most people are unconscious of our shadows because the dark side of us goes deep. Like Carl Jung said that the shadow reaches all the way down to hell. And most people don't want to recognize that they have that spirit of darkness within them and that capacity for evil. So we often project our shadows onto other people. Like Hitler was projecting his shadow onto the Jewish people, for example. So because he hadn't reconciled his own shadow, he saw it in other people. And that's something I'll talk about a lot through this presentation, is projection. Is like when we aren't consciously aware of those collective unconscious archetypes within, we end up seeing it in something else. And it's similar to how you were saying earlier, like you would have a thought and then see it in the external world, in like a bird or in some object. It's a psychological projection. It's some sort of unconscious contents that you haven't consciously grappled with, and the mind will find it's an automatic process. You can't control the projection. It just happens unconsciously. So it's something that wants to come to the surface. It finds some sort of external hook, and then you see it there. And these projections are happening all the time. Like even when you just meet someone new, you're projecting ideas onto them, they're projecting ideas onto you for you to figure each other out. So it's not like the projection mechanism is bad, but we're constantly projecting these unconscious ideas onto the external world, when really a lot of them are things that are within us. And one of those main archetypes is the shadow. So a lot of the start of Jungian psychoanalysis is trying to consciously recognize the shadow within, recognize your dark side. This is kind of like the first stage, because you don't really know your depths until you know your dark side. It's like Jordan Peterson says, like, you can't know what good is until you understand what evil is. And not evil as just some abstract entity or external to you, but evil is a capacity that's within you. So this is like the first stage of Jungian psychoanalysis. But then after you've integrated the shadow and keep going further into your unconscious, you'll eventually have to deal with the archetype of the animal. So
wow, that is a image. Wow, that is very interesting image.
Yep. And
wow.
Jung says
so you prompted that?
Yeah.
What kind of prompts are you using to get that?
Well, I'm specifically asking it to create an alchemical painting, create something in the style of an alchemical painting, because alchemical paintings had a specific structure and meaning.
Right. Yeah. Very symmetric, like what I was saying earlier. Remember when I was bringing up that symmetry earlier? See, like this is exactly it.
Exactly. And I'm also using some prompts to get that geometrical structure. Like if I put scientific diagram or knolling, like KNOLLING into the prompt, it will add this whole geometric structure to it. And I specifically prompt the AI to express the idea of the Jungian anima. So I'm like taking literal Jungian concepts and alchemical concepts and telling it to express that concept in the style of an alchemical painting.
This is wild. In the bottom left there, you have like these like beings that are like these half manifest beings that are like, they look like they're like being born right now, like they're coming out of that goo that you talked about, you know, that coagulation, like you're looking at the coagulation right now.
Yeah,
it's so wild. And then you have like the cosmos in her hair, it looks like in the upper right there. Oh, and you have the atom bomb. What the hell is going on?
Yep.
This is just wait until this becomes like 3-dimensional.
Yeah, exactly.
And then it just like, oh my God. And then it's in VR. And then you can go around. Oh my God. This is gonna be what's gonna happen by the time we die, like when we're in our 80s, what is gonna be happening?
Mate, I don't know what's going to be happening in the next 5 years with this.
Dude.
Like, I'm already
and then drugs.
By it.
What about the drugs that are going to be invented?
Yeah.
You know, you look at like, Alexander Shulgin.
No.
So Alexander Shulgin was this kind of like renegade chemist. He was an alchemist, really. And he had a laboratory in Berkeley, and he had this strange permit or permissions from the government to just create drugs. And so he has these 2 books called Pekel and Tekel, and it was all about these psychedelic drugs that he invented in his laboratory in his home in Berkeley. And it's like thousands of drugs. So there's thousands of psychedelic drugs that are listed in like an encyclopedia of compounds that's openly available on the market from just one guy.
Yeah.
You know, so there's something that's going to pop out of there. You know, it's like you look at, you know, like the rise of ketamine and what ayahuasca has been doing, psilocybin, blah, blah, blah. Like there's stuff that has, you know, like when you want to talk about alchemy, I mean, that's creating new drugs out of physical matter is, I mean, that's like the heart of alchemy, really, when I think about it. Like, what do you, I mean, and it's all just like right here.
I agree. And I'm wondering, like, what's going to happen once we're taking these substances? Like, if you do psilocybin or LSD and you're in VR in a couple of years, engaging with high fidelity images of the collective unconscious.
Yeah.
And you've got Neuralink installed. So Neuralink kind of knows what's going on in your brain. Like, I wonder if you could use these AI tools to like, kind of like engage in active imagination, similar to how Jung did with his Red Book, but through the AI images. And that's similar to what I'm doing, I think, because
that is what you're doing.
I'm generating.
That is the active
it's
active
imagination through the AI. Like, and I'm doing active imagination writing and drawing, separate from the AI as well. But I just wonder if this could be like a tool for people to psychologically understand themselves better.
But then how do you know what if it just takes you so far afield that you lose your mind?
There's always that possibility.
I mean, that happens just in reality. I mean, you look at somebody like Nietzsche, right? Where you typically are like, well, this is one of the most intelligent, insightful people of all time. And then he just like lost his mind. And nobody knows why, because it doesn't make sense. It's not like he had an obvious like physiological issue where you're like, oh yeah, he had syphilis or oh, he had epilepsy. Like the story with him is he just like hugged a horse and then lost his mind. And you're like, okay, well, if that can happen with one of the most intelligent, thoughtful philosophers of all time, that seems like he had insights into the nature of consciousness, you know, basically unrivaled by anybody else in his time. And he lost his mind. You know, what's going to happen when people have this kind of powerful tool in front of them? I mean, people are already losing their minds through technology right now. Like we're more mentally unstable right now than we probably, well, I don't know, who knows? It's hard to compare.
That's the thing with the unconscious, because like Jung deeply studied Nietzsche, and he saw Nietzsche in his writing in Zarathustra as like a confrontation with the unconscious. But and he was like the frontiersman of that time, like delving into the unconscious and engaging with it through active imagination. But he lost his mind because how did he know what to grapple onto? Like we didn't have any psychoanalysis or dream analysis yet. Like he was so far ahead of his time that it just broke him. And Jung went into that same process with his Red Book, but he reconciled it and he did it consciously. So although I think there's a huge risk of going insane anytime you confront the archetypes of the collective unconscious, there's also a pathway to becoming conscious of them and getting through it. And I think Nietzsche and Jung are kind of the two core archetypes of like how that can work and not work.
But Jung was able to discern because he was a human being making every decision. So every time he leapt into a pattern that he found interesting in archetypal structure and consciousness, it was him discerning what he wanted to look at and what he wanted to discard. So then when you have AI that's doing that process for you, you know, how many leaps down the road that are not under your control do you end up in that all of a sudden you'd be like, oh yeah, it's like these, you know, flat earthers that find, you know, a pattern that can make sense in some ways, you know, and you start connecting all these dots and you're like, well, actually the dots aren't really supported by reality, but they're supported enough to be able to kind of make sense through inference. And then all of a sudden you end up in this place where it's like birds aren't real, you know, or space doesn't exist or something. Like who's to say that that's not gonna happen? Well, it is gonna happen. Everything's gonna happen. And like all the things are gonna happen.
It's something that I'm concerned about because I'm generating these external AI generated images of alchemical ideas and using them to help become conscious of those archetypes within. But what if I have some religious experience looking at a AI generated painting that's off the mark in some way? And that's why I'm like, I'm not just using this external tool to generate these images. I'm also doing my own active imagination where I see the images purely in my own imagination, because, that's how I think people should think about it, because the AI isn't conscious. It's not connected to the divine in any way we know. It's going to be able to generate stunning images that could trigger a religious experience, but it doesn't mean you're going to be able to consciously reconcile that, because reconciling images come from within in your imagination.
But you don't think that the image that we're looking at right now is connected to the divine?
It's mimicking the divine, perhaps, but I think that it's connected to it in a living way, because it doesn't have a conscious body. But I don't know.
That little moment right there is where I am not clear about it.
Yeah.
And I also don't like how she's got like Hellraiser vibes. Like that part's really unnerving to me.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, the Animar is the Hellraiser though.
Yeah. Yeah, man.
I find this really interesting. In Jungian psychology, there's a contrasexual nature to the soul. So as a man, we have a feminine soul, which Jung called the anima, and women have a masculine soul that he called the animus. So I'm only showing one side of it here with the anima.
Yeah.
But I find that so fascinating, because it means that we have there's some deep connection between the masculine and the feminine within us, as if there's some unity between them. And I think you see that manifest today in like the trans culture and a lot of confusion about gender. But from psychological point of view, like we have a contrasexual soul that's like deeply connected with this. And Jung said that trying to consciously integrate the anima is extremely difficult. He said integrating the shadow, he called the apprentice piece, and said it's relatively easy. But integrating the anima, he said barely anyone does it. And he called it the masterpiece of like individuation. But
the masterpiece of individuation. That's great.
Yeah. Whereas the shadow integration is just the apprentice piece. But the ultimate goal of understanding these archetypes, and the core archetype that Jung came up with that is the center, I think, of his whole theory, is the self. And we've talked about this a lot. So whereas the ego is the center of the conscious mind, the self is the center of the psyche as a whole. So it's the central thing between the unconscious and the conscious mind. And I talked earlier about like a lot of people think that their personality is their ego, because the ego expresses individuality. But he's like, no, that's not the case. The center of your personality is the self, and it's something that transcends the bounds of your ego. Jung even said that it transcended time. And this is where, like, we've discussed this a little bit. I can barely wrap my head around it, but Jung said that the self stretches out for your whole life. So, and it interacts with you from the past and the future. So if you think about like all of the slices of your life of like who you are at any given time, it's like the self is the collection of all of those. So it's like your capacity for individuality as a whole. It's like if you were to fully live out your destiny, it would be something like this self. But that's an extremely difficult thing to conceptualize. And Jung thought of the self as the God image within. Because I think that in going into his inner psychology and trying to find these religious archetypes, he realized that you can't know God, but you can know the God image within you.
Yeah, that's such a critical point to make, and something that missing that allows for like all the wars and all the conflict. Like it's so far in there. And it's such a critical miss, that because everybody feels like they know what God is, and they're like, my God and your God and my God's more powerful, blah, 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 blah. And it's like the one God is beyond conception, right? That's like why in the ancient Jewish, mystical tradition, like it's the unnameable entity of and anytime you attach any sort of declarative statement about it, it's automatically not it. So it's the thing that's beyond description. But you can describe the image of God, and then once you do that, there's space for everybody. And so that jump from the image to God to whatever it is that God is, which is beyond conception, is so critical to just say, hey, nobody can know. Nobody can know, but we can know ourselves because we see it.
And isn't that a beautiful thing? That you can find the equivalent of the divine, or the most that you can know it within yourself. And I love that idea that we're made in the image of God. And I never used to understand that. I'm like, what do you mean we're made in the image of God? And what is that God image within us? So it seems to be like biologically grounded. We have some divine center that's like connected to God in some way. And it is our deepest self. It is our deepest personality. And it contains all opposites. That's the other thing. That's why this specific representation that AI generated is a mandala, because the self, symbols of the self always express themselves as a mandala, typically divided into 4 quadrants. So it's like a quaternary mandala, where
it is 4 quadrants.
Whereas the quaternary represents discrimination, or the logos,
right?
And the circle around it represents eros, or the wholeness. So it's like a bringing together of like the wholeness and discrimination. And Jung said that like this is the goal of his like psychoanalytic endeavor, is for you to discover yourself within. But it's a shattering experience, because the self contains all opposites. It contains all good and all evil, all light and dark. Like it's a baffling thing to consider. But he said that you want to get to a point where your ego is subordinate to yourself, because yourself is your deepest personality. And this is what people struggle to do, because they think that their ego is their personality, but it's not. It's just the locus of consciousness. But the self is the center between the conscious and the unconscious. So, and that's kind of gets to the idea of the Tao in Eastern philosophy, is like on the border between chaos and order.
Did you ever see that that I think it's a Pixar movie called Inside Out, about the little girl?
Yeah, I did.
She has this internal world that has all the marbles that come out.
Yeah.
And then it's reminding me of this.
Yeah.
And then have you looked into IFS, internal family system?
No.
It's like a psychological modeling of, basically, you have the self that is unchanging, and but it holds space for these different parts to come in, and everybody has these different parts, and the parts are there to be able to basically interact with the world. And so if you have like fears or angers or joys or whatever, so you have all these different parts which are in the system. They're actual entities that are living and breathing, that are agents. They're conscious agents inside of yourself, right?
Yeah.
So like if you have a part that's like the manager part, right? So you have like maybe this discernment mechanism where you're like maybe like listening to this presentation, and then there's this voice that comes up and you're like, nah, I don't really believe that, like I don't want to, like you're hesitant about it. That part is there so that the whole doesn't get swept away into formulating some model of reality that's going to end up undermining your stability in the world. So that part decides that it's their responsibility to come up to, they call it come into the living room. So it comes into the living room and it starts like organizing everybody, right? So it organizes all the other parts to be able to say like, all right, and it creates these coalitions with other parts to be able to protect the person. Because of past traumas. So they come into being because of past traumas. But it's this whole system called the IFS. I think you would find it really interesting.
That sounds deeply aligned with Jung's idea of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, because he saw them as like disconnected spirits. And they represent different parts of you. Like there's a spirit of rage, or like the spirit of Mars that can.
That's the Greek formulation.
And I think that like all the ancients used to see those as gods. And I think the whole monotheistic idea and Jung's psychoanalytic idea is that all those disembodied spirits actually unite under one thing, which he term the self. So they're like parts that help the whole keep together, like you said.
But the self is internal, right? And so are you saying that the self, like what you're referring to now, is an internal unification of all of these parts, and then the external self would be like Christ, who's fully man and fully God?
This is where it gets very complicated. I don't know, because if you read a lot of Jungian psychology, and he's saying that the self is something that you discover within. But he says if you start acting out yourself completely in the world, then you'll end up with more of yourself in the world than you will in you. And I find that staggering. Like and he's almost saying that there's like a world self underneath.
Right.
And he's like, and there's, because he lays out these like 3 stages of alchemical conjunction, and Jordan Peterson does as well. The first is recognizing your spirit and soul as one, I think, and then reconciling them with the body so you can act it out. But the third stage is to recognize yourself as the world, because if the self contains all opposites, then it contains every component of experience, not just what you're experiencing now. So you have to look at the world of experience as a whole that everyone is experiencing, and the world itself as yourself. And that's a staggering idea, and one that I find it very difficult to conceive of. And it's also confusing because Jung's saying that the self is to be discovered within, but the ultimate expression of it, you identify yourself as the world.
I mean, it also means that the world exists inside of consciousness. Like, this is what Nisargadatta always says about being the world is inside of consciousness. I don't know how to better state it.
Yeah. And there's a risk of psychological inflation there. It's the same as like thinking that you're
right. God. Yeah.
If you think that you're God, then you're going to think that you're omnipotent and omnipresent. If you think of that yourself is the world, I wonder what psychological effect it has on you. But I think Jung's pointing to the fact that you discover the self within, and then when you embody it and act it out, eventually it'll kind of become the world, or like there'll be more of yourself in the world than there will be in you. But that's about as much as I can say about it. It's very, very confusing.
Yeah, I love it. It's fascinating. It's kind of, in this image that we're looking at, kind of perfectly exemplifies that, because, on first glance, you look at it and you're like, oh, wow, this is really cool. This is really coherent. It's all laid out, logical, very rational, and then you actually look at it and you're like, what is in these balls? It's like they're nothing. They're like these little intimations of something. But you don't know what it is that they are. So it's like you're almost looking into a dream.
Exactly.
It's fascinating. I am really taken with all of these, each one of these images, except for that dark shadow one. I was like, no, that one's, I'll pass on that one. But these ones are really, really, really. And then I wonder, just as a little aside, when you're doing a prompt, could you, for instance, take this image and then say, make it more in the style of Art Nouveau, and then it would, that would be amazing.
You can take a link to an image and use that in a prompt, so you can link them together and keep riffing off it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, this is fascinating. I love, oh wow.
And this is like the last Jungian concept, which we've discussed.
Oh my God.
Individuation. And I found this image really resonated with me because it showed like these two paths, and you don't know which one's the right one. So the Jungian idea of individuation is how you integrate conscious and unconscious contents, and how you become yourself. And
this is a great piece of art, in my opinion. This is a fantastic piece of art, in my opinion. I think this is great. I think there's a lot of meaning. I think that there's a lot here to really consider. Like, you could meditate on this and get a lot of meaning out of it, in the same way that you can meditate on like Renaissance art. And it really, I mean, it prompts you to
Yeah, yeah.
Consider things, which is what the point of art is. Like, you know, divorce from the idea of like, is it like, where does it come from? Like, just divorce that.
Yeah.
And then just like the image in and of itself, if you didn't have any background to it, you didn't know about the artist or the biography or anything, you just had to consider it on its face. I think it's very powerful, very like there's a lot here to think about.
There's meaning embedded in here, and
fantastic.
Yeah.
It's really like fantastic.
The individuation was kind of, you can think of it as like the mythological way. Like, what's the path for you to become an individual, to become yourself, to find your destiny, and to integrate the unconscious? And Jung didn't see it as like a static set of stages. He saw it as kind of a cycle. So you're constantly going through this individuation process. So that leads me to Jung and alchemy. So Jung was studying dreams. He wrote his Red Book. He came up with his theory of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, but he didn't have a way to prove his theory. And this is why I think it's fascinating that he came across alchemy. He couldn't prove his theory because he was primarily pulling these ideas from other people's dreams and his analysis of those dreams. So it seemed entirely subjective. And a lot of his critics said, well, you're influencing the patient to come up with these images, and then you're just kind of putting your theory over the top of the dream analysis. But then Jung, in Jung's later years, he started going through these old alchemical manuscripts, and he found that they contained all of the same mythological symbolism that he was seeing in his patients' dreams, but even more high fidelity. So he hypothesized that alchemy might be an historical demonstration of individuation, and a historical demonstration of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, that he could say, hey, I didn't influence this. Like, this isn't my analysis. Like, all of these archetypes appear throughout the whole history of alchemy as a thread of ideas. So I really think he went into alchemy to prove out his ideas that he couldn't prove scientifically based on his dream analysis.
Because because the nature of science, the foundation of science is it has to be reproducible. Exactly. So there has to be there has to be something external that can be grounded in a shared reality that's not merely in the individual's experience.
Exactly. And in alchemy, he found these hundreds of alchemists over hundreds of years that were participating, and there was this thread throughout it that demonstrated his ideas. And a lot of why Jung came to alchemy, and I just want to, I'm going to delve into some alchemical images after this, but Jung found that the church had this doctrine that they call privatio boni, which basically means the absence of good.
Yeah.
And they defined evil not as a living spirit that was real and just as real as God. Evil is just the absence of good. And I've heard you say this before as well. And I think it's a common way of looking at evil. Yeah. But he thinks that seeing evil as just the absence of good created a psychological schism in Christians, because it set up God and Christ as only good and set up base matter as completely corrupt. And then it forced the Christian to worship Christ as an external object instead of recognizing him as a living spirit within, because we'd cut off half of his energy. And so the church basically says there's a clear separation between good and evil, and a clear separation between heaven and earth, or heaven and hell. And Jung said, like, no, like there might not be. And it's funny because a lot of the alchemists were devoted Christians, believing Christians and believing in Christ. But the church was telling them that Christ had finally saved them, like through his accepting the sins of the world on his shoulders. He had like given us some final salvation. But the problem that the alchemists face is the problem that I face, is that I don't feel saved. I still feel like corrupt and sinful and in need of salvation. So what this privatio boni doctrine and the schism, psychological schism in the church, it kind of forced alchemists to start looking for God in matter. So, and this is where the idea of unconscious projection comes in. So basically that the church had a bunch of gaps because of their dogmatic way of looking at good and evil. There was a bunch of gaps that weren't being recognized. And when the alchemists were looking into their chemical transformations in their vessels, they started having visions. So they would see an image of a phoenix emerging, or they would see an image of a king and a queen holding hands. And it's the same as when you said that you would have a thought and then see it in a bird. It's an unconscious projection. And because back then matter was completely unknown, it provided the perfect hook and it was very visual and showed, you know, liquids turning into solids and back and forth, different colors like heat and light.
Yeah, they also had another substance that we don't take seriously now. That was ether. Yeah, right? And it was like the unconscious. It was sort of like the material that mediated in between conscious experience and the physical world. And then people believed that it was like in the atmosphere. There was like quality of the Earth's atmosphere called the ether, and like spirits would communicate through it. Like during like the late 1800s, you know, with the rise of theosophy and the whole spiritualism, that, you know, and seances and Ouija boards and all of that stuff, it was really enabled by this idea of ether that nobody could put their finger on, but it was the thing that allowed the transmission of the spirit realm to connect with this world.
And Jung actually says this story about, so when scientists started to think that the ether wasn't real in the late 1800s, there's a story of this famous scientist who was presenting saying that ether's not real. And this old man stood up from the crowd and he was like emotional and passionate. And he said, if ether is not real, then nothing exists, because he was projecting the idea of God into the ether. And as soon as like science said, oh, that doesn't exist, like his whole idea of God and his whole idea of reality disappeared. And it's that same idea of projection. So the alchemists were looking into their vessels, seeing these chemical transformations and having visions of unconscious images. And they were designed to be uniting. So, and this is like a lot of the symbolism that appears in alchemy is a union of opposites. And this goes back to the fact that I think that it's a balance for the schism of the dogmatic church that said that everything's separate, that good and evil are separate. The alchemists, while they were looking into their vessels, started seeing all these visions of a union of sun and moon, which constantly appears. So it's a union of masculine and feminine. So Jung thinks that the whole alchemical endeavor psychologically is trying to unify opposites within. And if you think of the self as being the symbol that unites all opposites, that makes sense. And if there's this schism in the church that's creating this unnecessary divide between things, then these symbols can help you become conscious of their unity, like become conscious of the unity between dark and light, of God and the devil, or Christ and Satan, of Cain and Abel, like all these opposites. And you see this in a lot of different images. Like there's an image that appears often is the mystical marriage of the king and queen. It's often the red king and the white queen. So there's like a particular aesthetic to a lot of these images as well. Another one is the famous alchemical dictum, as above, so below.
That is amazing. That image is amazing. Oh my God, that is so cool. So you prompted this image?
Yeah. I'm like,
what was the prompt on this?
I'm like, create an alchemical painting that expresses the alchemical dictum, as above, so below. Created this.
This is fantastic. The foreground and background and how it like, it's almost like a binocular. Oh my God, there's so much here. It's like you're looking through binoculars, but that upward swell in the bottom that has all those like orbs and beings in it, that feels like it's the background and the foreground at the same time. And then it goes up and dissolves into this mid ground that becomes the thing that you're looking through, which is this fantastical land that's like kind of alien and real at the same time. The symmetry is all there.
Yeah.
It's got like this apocalyptic foreground and this and the civilization in the background. You have the one side that's like muted earthy colors, the other side that's the white color. You have what is in the background? It's like a bridge or a dam with like this science fiction metropolis back there. It's like, what the hell is going on here?
Yeah, and you've got like these old houses and this like advanced civilization looking.
Yeah. What the fuck is going on? And then this is just astounding. If you look at this as intentional, like an artist is trying to tell you something and express it in images and not in words, you're like, what is being said here?
Yeah, and
that's why I'm very interesting.
I'm specifically focused on using AI to generate images that can unite opposites like this and express these alchemical dictums, because I think they'll be able to, the AI is going to do it in a very unique way that that a human might struggle to do. But this represents that idea of like whatever is above and heavenly is also below. And the church didn't see it that way. The church thought that like God is in heaven and we're in corrupt earth.
Yeah.
And alchemists started saying like, no, what if God is in matter itself and in the matter within us? And that
you've never gotten into Swedenborg, right? Emmanuel Swedenborg.
You told me about him, but I haven't.
This idea of correspondence, I think it's time. I think it's time that you kind of check this dude out. And if you just do some research on Swedenborg's concept of correspondence, it is the experience of above and below, literally to him, corresponding.
Yeah.
And the heavenly world influences the lower world, because you have like involution, which is the spiritual world impacting the manifestation of the spiritual world, and then evolution, which is matter, evolving up into a higher form. And there's a bunch of like a near-death experience, like NDE stuff. Like, unfortunately, the aesthetics of NDE experiences are just horrific. But if you can get through that and listen to what these just completely normal people say about pushing through the threshold between what we typically think of death and this other conscious reality that they experience and come back into, oftentimes they're witnessing aspects of what you're talking about here. It's something I would be really curious to see you start pushing into that. I do also have to mention one thing too, is that I'm getting an alert on my battery, which is kind of getting down, and my power cord is in my shop up the road. So I only got probably got like 20 minutes max.
That's perfect.
Just like, I mean, I know we're going long, but this is fascinating. I mean, I love everything that you're presenting here. And these images are blowing my mind. I mean, you sent them to me. You sent some of this stuff in text and I was like, oh, okay, they're cool. But now seeing them this large is amazing. Like if this was a mural on the side of a building, people would be like, what is happening? It would be amazing. I would love that.
Yeah. So anyways, let me try and wrap up the last images in the next 15 minutes.
Okay.
But so there's this big idea in alchemy, union of opposites, to try and heal the schism created by the church in a way. And the last representation of that you're well aware of is the Ouroboros. So the self-eating snake. So it devours itself, it weds itself, and it creates itself. And Jung thought that the Ouroboros was the symbol of excellence, like, or symbol of unity of opposites par excellence, because it's like the dragon of chaos, like potential. It's got legs, so it's like grounded. It has wings, so it's heavenly. So there's this constant idea that you're seeing throughout alchemy, which is like the unity of opposites. And then the question becomes like, how do you become conscious of the union of opposites within? And the alchemists thought that the secret to that was what they called the Philosopher's Stone. We've all heard of the Philosopher's Stone.
Yeah.
You see it in Harry Potter, and you see it in all sorts of different literature and movies. But they thought they were trying to find a substance that could transform lead into gold. And when they talk about the stone, it had all these weird attributes. Like they said, it's the rarest thing in the world, but it's also the most common thing that everyone just ignores. Or they said that it's the stone that the builders rejected. So it's like this substance, and they said that you've got to, you should make the stone that the builders rejected the foundation stone. And that the stone also united all opposites. So they were like, a lot of their efforts were focused on finding the Philosopher's Stone and like fleshing out the symbolism of the Philosopher's Stone. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a few slides, because it's deeply important, and I think it connects back to religion. Another really interesting one is the spirit Mercurius, or the spirit of Mercury. So if you think about the substance of Mercury, like liquid mercury, it's silver and it's self-reflective. So you can't see into it. It just reflects the outside world. So the alchemists were projecting all sorts of ideas into it. And a very interesting chemical property of mercury is that if you put it in ore, it will extract the gold. So it pulls out the gold. So because it was pulling out gold from base metals, the alchemists just projected that it was part of that thing that helps you find gold, or like draw gold out of something. And Mercury is also the Roman god, Roman messenger of the gods. So he was like a winged messenger. Sometimes he was a very paradoxical figure, though, because sometimes he appeared to you as a friend who was helping guide you, but other times he appeared to you as a trickster that was like leading you down a bad path. And he kind of flitted about all the time. And I didn't really get this until I heard Jordan Peterson talking about it, but he said that the spirit Mercurius is your sense of interest and meaning. And that's the conclusion to maps of meaning, is the divinity of interest. So Peterson lays out a theory that our sense of interest and meaning is divine, and it's that our primary pathway to find ourselves, to weave our way through the world. So when you when you walk into a bookstore, for example, and you notice your mind just like pulls your attention to a specific book, that's the spirit Mercurius telling you to look at that. And it's like an unconscious thing. And Peterson's saying that should be your primary guide in life, is your own sense of self-interest and meaning. And the alchemists they projected that whole idea of our sense of interest into the spirit Mercurius, which is kind of the thing that like guided you towards the philosophical goal.
That's very, very interesting. I've never seen that archetype at play in that. Yeah, it's
exactly.
So you're saying Mercury is the spirit of your interest?
Yeah, it's
or meaning.
Both. They're the same thing.
Both. Okay.
I think that
okay. So wait. So the assumption. Okay, so the assumption there is that what you're interested is the manifestation of meaning in your life.
Exactly.
Okay, so they're like interest is the thing that you perceive first, but it's connected to meaning. So meaning and interest are the same thing, but they're different aspects of it, and they're like temporally related.
Exactly.
So again, like the alchemical idea of you're playing with time. So interest is what hits first, and then you follow your interest through time, and then it lands in meaning.
But
meaning.
Yeah, and then for that interest to be generated in the first place, there must have been some meaning behind it already. So I think you're right that interest and meaning are the same thing deep down, but to us they manifest in a temporal way of like being interested first, and then we consciously discover the meaning. But the meaning was already there in the interest, otherwise you wouldn't be interested in it.
So meaning, meaning is in the collective unconscious before you even arrive.
Yes.
And then interest is the signal
yes
of where the meaning is. And then when you find that meaning, it becomes meaningful to you in particular.
Yes.
So that's your subjective unconscious. So now you have meaning. So, and then once you align meaning in the subjective or in the personal unconscious and the collective unconscious, now you're oriented in the world and you have a stable path through objective reality, and that'll keep you grounded and that'll stop you from losing your mind.
Yes. And you,
is that fair?
Yeah. And Jung and Peterson say that this spirit of interest that guides you is yourself calling to you from outside the bounds of time, telling you what to focus on. So it's actually a manifestation of the self. It's your deepest self telling you what you should focus on to become it.
And then that formulation is, you have your ego, and then behind that so you have your ego, but then the self envelops all of that. Right.
Yeah.
So your ego is a part, is like an orb, like one of those orbs that we just saw in the picture.
It's like the self is like this ball underneath, and the ego kind of floats above it. Like the ego is nested within the self in an ideal situation. And that's what you should become conscious of. It should be subordinate to the self.
Right.
And but you then do that by following your sense of meaning.
But then the self is oriented similarly to God in some way.
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
But then the question is, are they really separate? Is that orb that you're talking about on top of this, or is it inside of the self? So I intuitively see it as like ego inside of the self, self inside of God or the divine or the image of the divine.
Yeah, I think that's
and then that is, and then that's nested inside of whatever it is that God is that you can't see. That's as big as the universe, but also something specific, which is the alpha and the omega.
Yep.
Are you seeing that?
Yep. I totally
okay.
fine with that.
Interesting.
So I thought of something like sitting on top of something, but it's really like
it's inside, right?
You have your ego. Outside of that is yourself or the God image within you.
Yeah.
And that's connected somehow to God in a way that I can't understand at all.
So I would be very curious to take this little snippet that we just talked about right now, reduce it into language as efficiently as possible, and then put that as a prompt into your AI image generating tool and see what it comes up with.
Yep.
You think you could do that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, I'd be very curious to see what that is.
Yeah. So to conclude, I've got two last images left. So
cool.
The whole idea of alchemy, they were trying to turn lead into gold, but they never did. But the whole time they were unconsciously talking about finding spiritual gold. It's like finding that unification and that higher being within. But the last thing I wanted to show you, and this is the most mind-blowing thing that I came across in his work on alchemy, is that the philosopher's stone is the same thing as the self, and it's the same thing as Christ. They're all one thing.
Okay. We got to take this slow.
Yeah.
Okay. Philosopher's stone is the same as the self, which is the same as Christ. Okay.
So
it's almost like the God. It's almost like the Trinity.
Yeah, in a way. Yeah. Because the church set up Christ as this figure who's only good, and because of that, the alchemists started looking for God in matter. So they were projecting all the missing ideas of Christ into the philosopher's stone. So they're like complementary, and they're talking about the same thing deep down. And Christ is also a symbol of the self, and the philosopher's stone is also a symbol of the self, which is also the God image, which I could have as another equal sign here. But I see this idea of the Christ lapis parallel, or the parallel between Christ and the philosopher's stone, is a bridge between modern psychoanalytic thinking and the oldest religious ideas. That's why I'm so interested in alchemy, because I think it provides this symbolic bridge that like connects religion and science, and like fleshes out a lot of the missing ideas in the Christian myth that got created because of the dogmatic church. And I know that that's something that you and I have had issues with, is like the institution of the dogmatic church, and like that it doesn't fully represent our own experience with religion. But the whole the whole point of alchemy was to flesh that out, and I think it did, and it did through the symbol of the philosopher's stone.
Yeah, this idea is like basically impenetrable to me. Yeah. Man, that's this again with the AI, that, you know what, I when I mentioned earlier with the previous image, that slightly off symmetry.
Yeah,
that's off by like
you can see
7 to 10. Like you look at the nose, you're like, that is just slightly off.
And like look at these weird ass hands too.
I know. But actually, in the way that I paint, I do this on purpose. You know, like when I do my grids, you know, I have, because it's all hand drawn. It's like everybody says, like, why is it so, you know, how do you get it so perfect? And I'm like, it's not perfect. It's all just equally slightly off.
Yeah.
But altogether, it reads perfect because I'm looking at it how it reads, like in space, like to a human mind. But if you were to measure it, you'd be like, oh, everything's like a couple degrees off.
Yeah.
But altogether, it averages balance.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, so that's very interesting that kind of AI is doing that. And then I find that I'm doing that in my work too. But yeah, that perfectly exemplified by that north spike not lining up with Christ's nose is like exactly what I was seeing in the other images. But it was just like slightly infuriating. It's also really wild that image is like in front of Christ. It seems like the image of Christ should be in front with that compass thing like behind it, you know.
Yeah, and I'm sure if I generated like 5 more images, it would generate
one of them would come up.
Variations. Like I prompted an AI yesterday to create like an alchemical painting image representing the philosopher's stone, and specifically asked it to constrain the image within a circle of 4 quadrants. And because Jung thought that was the ultimate symbol that helped unite conscious and unconscious content. So I forced the AI to like boil it symbolically into that structure. And I created like 100 different photos of it, and then turned them all into videos. And just the diversity of images that it created is mind blowing. So it's not just creating one image, it's one of a billion different images it could create. But I think there's meaning in here. I don't know.
Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about since you've been talking is, you know, we both regard Jung and his shamanistic practice of going into the unconscious. We both consider it like the highest of the highest reality, or like we value that very highly, and we respect his process. Okay, central to his process in his active imagination process was treating what arose as real and then becoming in dialogue with it. I would challenge you to extend that active imagination process with AI in the images that it's producing, and treating them as actual entities or actual conscious agents that are trying to tell you something. Because maybe this AI, I mean, that's crazy, right?
That's a dangerous idea.
I know, dude. I don't want to do it. But maybe you do it. I mean, honestly, it's like even looking at these images, I'm a little bit scared.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, because the way that I look at art is I really open myself up to it. Like when Da Vinci, when I'm in front of a Da Vinci painting, and I told you about that Stendhal syndrome moment that I had.
Yeah,
it's because I'm allowing, through trust, like on some level, some like physiological level, for him to speak to me through his painting, because and then if you're allowing this stuff in from AI that's undifferentiated from a divine connection, it's like, what's getting into you?
Yeah, what am I trusting?
Right. Like, am I being rewired in this way that's going to like put me down the left-handed path to Satan? Like, is this a satanic, is this the way that the Antichrist like gets in and like rearranges like all these archetypal forms? I mean, it would be the most diabolical, world-changing moment in human evolution. Like maybe this is maybe this is the apocalyptic moment where, you know, 90% of the people like just veer off into darkness, and like, you know, there's only this small, which kind of fits into like Revelation and the prophecies of, you know, the Jews and the Hindus, and, you know, I mean, it's wild. But the other thing is, like, in order to be able to understand that, the hero, the new Christ that emerges, has to go into that as well. Exactly. Because in order to be able to save or connect with humanity that's being lost, that's going into the desert of AI, there has to be a new Moses that comes down off the mountain and says, no, go over here. You know? And so that's squarely what your path is in doing this to some degree. So, I mean, I think that you're peeling the lid off of some very, very interesting material here. And it's fascinating to know you for this, you know, this amount of time, and to see that it's all connecting with this. I think you're gonna find a lot of value here, and I think it is going to be one of the sculpting forces of your life going forward, because so many things align here, and whatever it is that you ultimately end up doing is present right now. And, you know, you're mixing the batter to bake the cake right now. Like you're in the mixing process of creating this thing. So I think it's fascinating where it is that you're going. I'm very happy for you. I'm very excited.
Thanks, man. And just because there's that huge satanic risk that I hold these images up as some sort of external idol that's false. But they're also helping me understand this stuff. Like I was better able to articulate these ideas about alchemy to you today by generating these thousands of images and putting these images into our conversation. So I'm finding them pragmatically useful in some way. It's hard for me to say what I trust or what I think is divine or what's real art, but I'm just finding it pragmatically useful. And yeah, thank you for conversations like this too. Like this is an awesome way for me to like play these ideas out to you and get your thoughts. Because like I said, I'm not explaining to you what I know. I'm trying to think this through.
Yeah, I'm super interested in it. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And it is a good intersection in between what it is that I'm doing in my work and, you know, your interests. So I think there's a lot here that is very interesting to me. And yeah, I'll be curious to see like how it manifests as art in the future, because it is inevitable that it's influencing my work for sure. And yeah, it's going to influence your work as well. So I'm very excited to be able to see where it is. And I like the format of presenting images and grounding in the visual. I think that's really good for both of us, because we can tend to, you know, I mean, it's super fun to kind of have unhinged explorations into just raw consciousness, but it's cool when it's grounded in an image. I like this format.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, cool. I'm about to run out of batteries, so
good timing.
Wrap it up. Yeah, that's perfect.
All right. Thanks for your time, mate. Great chatting with you.
Yeah. Talk to you soon.
All right.
See you, man. Later.